A divorced mom adopted an old German Shepherd, but she never expected what this dog would uncover. At first, it seemed like a simple act of kindness, rescuing a lonely animal off a stormy pier. But every night, the dog kept pulling her back to the same spot, pawing, whining, almost begging her to find something hidden beneath the boards. And when she finally lifted that plank, what she found inside wasn't just shocking, it was a secret buried for generations. Letters from a forgotten soldier, a medal tied to a love story no one ever knew. Now, the past is clawing its way back into the present, and this mom is about to learn the truth about her own family that changes everything she thought she knew. What secret was hidden beneath the pier for decades, and why did the dog lead her there? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. The morning after the storm dawned quiet and pearl gray. Eleanor Martin stood at her cottage window, watching the last raindrops slide down the glass. The weather matched her mood, subdued but slowly clearing. 6 months after her divorce, she still wasn't used to the silence of living alone. She pulled on her well-worn rubber boots and a warm jacket. The familiar weight of dog treats in her pocket reminded her of happier days when she and her ex-husband would walk their old golden retriever, Max, along this very beach. But Max was gone now, staying with her ex in the city, and Eleanor was learning to walk these shores alone. The sand was wet and firm under her feet as she made her way down to the beach. Debris from last night's storm littered the shoreline, driftwood, seaweed, and scattered shells tossed up by the angry waves. The air smelled fresh and clean, that special scent that always followed a storm, like nature had given everything a good wash. As she approached the old pier, something caught her eye. At the far end, a large dark shape sat motionless against the misty horizon. Eleanor squinted, then caught her breath. It was a dog, a German Shepherd, she realized as she drew closer, sitting absolutely still, staring out at the waves as if hypnotized. "Oh, you poor thing," she whispered to herself. Even from a distance, she could see the dog wasn't in good shape. Its coat was matted and dull, and something about the way it held itself spoke of neglect. Eleanor hesitated at the pier's entrance. The old wooden structure had weathered countless storms, but she always felt a little nervous walking its length. Today, though, concern for the dog overcame her caution. She took her first careful step onto the weathered planks. "Hello there," she called softly, not wanting to startle the animal. The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't turn around. Eleanor moved forward slowly, the wooden boards creaking beneath her feet. "It's okay, sweet one. I won't hurt you." As she got closer, she could see the dog more clearly. It was indeed a German Shepherd, probably male, and definitely in rough shape. His ribs showed through his dirty coat, and old scars marked his face and shoulders. But what struck Eleanor most was his eyes, deep brown and filled with such sadness it made her heart ache. The dog whimpered softly, pawing at the wooden planks beneath him. The sound was so mournful it brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. She stopped about 10 feet away, not wanting to crowd him. "Are you hungry?" she asked gently, reaching into her pocket. The dog's ears perked up at the rustling sound. "I've got some treats here. They're pretty good. I used to carry them for Max." She pulled out a handful of the small bone-shaped biscuits. The dog's nose twitched, but he still seemed reluctant to move from his spot. He pawed at the planks again, whining. "It's okay," Eleanor coaxed, taking a small step closer. "Look what I've got." She held out a treat, then carefully tossed it halfway between them. The dog watched it land but didn't move. Eleanor waited patiently, talking in a soft, steady stream of gentle nonsense. "Such a good boy. Such a handsome fellow, even if you are a bit worse for wear. Nobody's going to hurt you here." Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the dog took a hesitant step toward the treat. Eleanor noticed immediately that he was favoring his left back leg. Her heart clenched at the sight of his limping gait. The dog sniffed the treat, then quickly ate it, looking up at Eleanor with cautious hope. She smiled and tossed another one, this time a little closer to her. Slowly, treat by treat, she coaxed him toward her. When he was finally close enough to touch, Eleanor held very still, letting him sniff her hand. His nose was cold and wet, a good sign she remembered from her years with Max. Gradually, she reached out and touched his head. He flinched slightly but didn't pull away. "That's it," she murmured. "Good boy. Such a good, brave boy." She stroked his head gently, feeling the matted fur under her fingers. Up close, she could see he was in even worse shape than she'd thought. Besides the limp and the matted coat, there were half-healed cuts on his face and shoulders. "You can't stay out here," she said firmly. "Would you like to come home with me? Just for now, until we can figure out where you belong." The dog looked at her with those soulful eyes, then back at the waves, whimpering again. "I know, sweet boy, I know something's troubling you. But it's not safe out here, and you need food and warmth." She stood slowly, keeping her hand on his head. "Come on. Let's get you somewhere safe." The walk back to her cottage was slow. The dog limped beside her, stopping every few steps to look back at the pier. Eleanor kept up a steady stream of gentle encouragement, and occasionally offered another treat when he seemed particularly reluctant to continue. Inside her cottage, Eleanor quickly set about making her unexpected guest comfortable. She filled a bowl with water, which the dog lapped up eagerly, and another with some leftover chicken from her dinner the night before. "We'll get you proper dog food tomorrow," she promised, watching him eat. "For now, this will have to do." While he ate, Eleanor gathered some old blankets and arranged them near the fireplace. The spring evenings were still chilly, and she wanted him to be warm. She also found an old towel and gently dried off his wet fur as best she could around the matted areas. "Tomorrow, we'll see about getting you to a vet," she told him, working carefully around what looked like tender spots. "Get you cleaned up properly, and check out that leg." The dog finished eating and investigated his new bed, turning around 3 times, before settling onto the blankets with a heavy sigh. Eleanor smiled, remembering how Max used to do the same thing. "Good boy," she said softly. "Get some rest." But as she prepared for bed herself, she noticed the dog growing restless. He got up from his blankets and went to the window that faced the beach, whining softly. Even when she called to him, he wouldn't move from his spot, his gaze fixed in the direction of the pier. Eleanor watched him for a moment from her bedroom doorway, her heart heavy with concern. Whatever had brought this dog to that pier, whatever he had been through, it clearly wasn't something he could forget easily. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're safe now, we'll figure this out together." But the dog continued his vigil at the window, his whines a sad soundtrack to the night. The morning sunlight streamed through Eleanor's kitchen window, casting warm patterns on the worn linoleum floor. As she cracked eggs into a bowl, she felt eyes watching her every move. The German Shepherd sat in the doorway, his posture perfect despite his injuries, observing her with an air of quiet dignity. "You know," Eleanor said, whisking the eggs, "I can't keep calling you boy or dog. You need a proper name." She glanced over at him, noting how he seemed to melt into the shadows of the doorway despite his size. "Shadow," she said softly. "That's what I'll call you. Do you like that?" The dog's ears perked up slightly, and Eleanor took that as agreement. "Shadow, it is, then." As she cooked, Eleanor noticed how Shadow followed her movements with an almost military precision, his eyes tracking her path across the kitchen. Despite his obvious hunger, he made no attempt to beg or whine. He simply waited, patient and proper, like a gentleman at a formal dinner. "Such good manners," Eleanor murmured, setting down a bowl of scrambled eggs mixed with the last of yesterday's chicken. "Someone trained you well." After breakfast, Eleanor called the local veterinary clinic. Dr. Sarah Chen had been treating the pets in their small coastal town for over 15 years. Fortunately, they had an opening that morning. "Come on, Shadow," Eleanor said, grabbing her car keys. "Time to get you checked out." The drive to the vet was interesting. Shadow sat perfectly in the backseat, but his eyes never left the window facing the ocean. Even when they turned inland, he craned his neck to keep the water in view. The veterinary clinic was a small, cheerful building with paw prints painted on the windows. Inside, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and pet shampoo. Shadow stayed close to Eleanor's leg as they waited, his body tense but controlled. Dr. Chen, a petite woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked black hair, greeted them warmly. So, this is our mystery patient, she said, kneeling slowly to Shadow's level. Hello there, handsome. In the exam room, Dr. Chen's professional demeanor shifted to concern as she examined Shadow more closely. He's definitely been through something, she said, running gentle hands over his body. These scars are old, but they've healed well. Professional work, I'd say. Eleanor watched as the vet continued her examination. The 4-day limp in his back leg. Is it serious? It's an old injury, Dr. Chen explained, carefully manipulating the leg. See how he compensates for it? That's learned behavior. This kind of adjustment typically comes from proper rehabilitation training. She paused, examining Shadow's ears. Ah, interesting. What is it? Eleanor leaned closer. There's a tattoo here, Dr. Chen said, using a small light to examine the inside of Shadow's ear. It's faded, but it's definitely some kind of official registration number. This dog had a serious job at some point, military or police work, most likely. Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. She thought about Shadow's perfect posture, his controlled behavior, the way he seemed to be constantly on duty. Can you tell what organization he belonged to? Dr. Chen shook her head. The tattoo's too faded. I can take some photos and make some inquiries if you'd like. She straightened up, making notes on her chart. Otherwise, despite his recent neglect, he's in remarkably good shape for his age. I'd estimate he's about 8 or 9 years old. He needs some good food, regular exercise, and lots of TLC. The bill was substantial: blood work, vaccines, medication for his various scrapes, and preventative treatments. Eleanor paid it without hesitation. Something about Shadow's quiet strength, his wounded dignity, had worked its way into her heart. Thank you, she told Dr. Chen as they prepared to leave. For being so thorough. Of course, the vet smiled. He's a special one. You can see it in his eyes. She handed Eleanor a bag of medications and care instructions. Call me if you notice anything concerning. That evening, Eleanor decided to take Shadow for a walk along the beach. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The sea breeze carried the familiar scent of salt and seaweed, and Shadow seemed to perk up as they approached the shoreline. Everything was fine until they neared the pier. Suddenly, Shadow's demeanor changed completely. The calm, dignified dog transformed into an urgent, pulling force. Eleanor, caught off guard, struggled to maintain her grip on the leash. Shadow, easy, she called, but he was focused entirely on the pier now. He dragged her forward with surprising strength for an injured dog, making straight for the spot where she'd found him the night before. When they reached the area, Shadow began pawing insistently at one of the wooden planks. It was loose, moving slightly under his paw. He whined, looking up at Eleanor with pleading eyes, then back at the plank. Eleanor knelt beside him, her hand resting on his back. What is it, boy? What are you trying to show me? But Shadow just continued pawing at the plank, his actions becoming more urgent with each passing moment. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she examined the loose plank. The weathered wood felt rough beneath her touch, and salt air whipped her hair around her face. Shadow sat beside her, his tail thumping softly against the pier boards, watching her every move with intense focus. Okay, let me see what's got you so worked up, Eleanor murmured, running her hands along the edges of the board. She could feel where it had come loose from its mounting, probably from years of exposure to the elements. The nails had rusted and worked their way free, leaving the plank mobile enough to lift. Shadow whined softly, pawing at the spot again. The evening sun cast long shadows across the pier, and the waves beneath them created a gentle, rhythmic thumping against the pilings. Eleanor dug her fingers into the gap and pulled upward. The plank resisted at first, then came free with a loud creak. She set it aside carefully, mindful of any rusty nails. Shadow immediately thrust his nose toward the dark space revealed beneath. Careful, boy, Eleanor cautioned, placing a restraining hand on his collar. She peered into the gap between the support beams. At first, she saw nothing but shadows and cobwebs, but then something caught her eye, a glint of metal in the fading light. Wedged between two crossbeams was a tin box, about the size of a thick novel. It was heavily rusted, its once bright surface dulled by decades of salt air and humidity. Eleanor reached down carefully, her fingers just managing to brush against its surface. "It stuck pretty good," she told Shadow, who watched with unwavering attention. She reached deeper, ignoring the splinters, pressing into her knee through her jeans. Finally, her fingers found purchase on the box's edge. With a firm tug, it came free, bringing with it a shower of dust and debris. The box was heavier than she'd expected. Whatever was inside had some weight to it. The lid was sealed shut with rust, but Eleanor could make out the remnants of what might have been decorative embossing on its surface. "Well, Shadow," she said, turning the box over in her hands, "you certainly led me to something interesting." The dog's tail wagged once, his eyes fixed on the box. The sun was setting rapidly now, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. The temperature was dropping, and Eleanor could feel the evening dampness settling in. "Let's take this home where we can examine it properly." Shadow seemed satisfied with this plan. He walked calmly beside her as they made their way back along the pier, no longer pulling or showing signs of agitation. It was as if, having accomplished his mission, he could finally relax. Back in her cottage, Eleanor set the box carefully on her kitchen table. The warm light from her overhead lamp revealed more details. The box had once been painted, traces of dark green still visible beneath the rust. There were also what appeared to be German words stamped into the metal, though they were too corroded to read clearly. She spent several minutes working at the lid, first trying to pry it open with her fingers, then carefully using a butter knife to break through the rust seal. Finally, with a metallic groan, the lid lifted. Inside, protected from the elements, were several letters, the paper yellow with age but still intact. They were folded neatly, the creases sharp and precise despite the passing years. Beneath them lay something else, a medal, its surface tarnished but still recognizable as a military decoration. Eleanor lifted the medal carefully. It was heavy in her palm, its ribbon faded from what might once have been vibrant colors to muted grays and browns. The medal itself bore German inscriptions and symbols that she couldn't decipher. Setting the medal aside with reverence, she turned her attention to the letters. They were written in precise German script, the ink faded but still legible. Each one was dated, spanning several months in 1943. Shadow had settled himself by her feet, his head resting on his paws but his eyes still alert. The kitchen clock ticked softly in the background as Eleanor carefully unfolded the first letter. The paper was delicate, and she handled it with utmost care, spreading it flat on the table under the lamp's warm light. Taking a deep breath, she began to read aloud, her voice soft in the quiet room. The German words were foreign to her, but at the bottom of the first page, there was a translation in different handwriting, clearly added later, perhaps by the recipient. As she read the translated words, Eleanor felt her breath catch. The letter began, "My dearest Helen, I hope this finds you well in Seavale Harbor." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly. Seavale Harbor, her town. This letter, written during World War II, had been sent to someone who had lived right here. The words that followed were both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Though the war keeps us apart, my thoughts are always with you. The memory of our walks along your pier gives me strength during these dark days." Eleanor sat back in her chair, stunned by the revelation. These weren't just any letters, they were love letters, written by a young German soldier to an American girl, right here in her own town, during one of the most difficult periods in history. Shadow raised his head, looking at her with those knowing eyes, as if he'd understood all along the importance of what he'd led her to discover. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of Seavale Harbor Public Library, as Eleanor settled at her desk in the research department. She had arrived early, before the library opened to the public, bringing the tin box and Shadow with her. As a senior librarian, she had the privilege of keeping her companion close, and today she was especially grateful for his steady presence. Eleanor spread the letters carefully on her desk, handling the aged paper with reverence. The familiar scent of books and wood polish surrounded her as she pulled up the library's translation software on her computer and reached for several German-English dictionaries from the reference section. "Let's see what stories you have to tell," she murmured, selecting the first letter. Shadow lay down beside her desk with a contented sigh, his watchful eyes never leaving her. The translation work was slow but absorbing. Eleanor cross-referenced words between the software and books, wanting to ensure accuracy. As the morning wore on, the letters began to tell their story, and her heart ached at the beauty and longing they contained. My dearest Helen. One letter read, "The moon tonight reminds me of our evening walks along the shore. Even here, so far from you, I see the same stars we watched together. Each one feels like a promise that we will meet again." The writer signed himself simply as Lucas. His words were poetry wrapped in desperate yearning. Eleanor found herself pausing often, moved by the depth of emotion preserved in these yellowed pages. "I dream of the small white house with blue shutters." Another letter revealed, "Where you showed me such kindness. The memory of your mother's apple pie and your father's stern but fair gaze gives me hope that one day, when this madness ends, I might know such simple pleasures again." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she input the address from one envelope into the library's historical records database. 217 Oak Street, she whispered. The street still existed, though the numbers had changed over the decades. Diving deeper into property records from the 1940s, Eleanor found herself following a trail of familiar names. The Petersons had owned the hardware store. The Sullivans had run the post office. These weren't just historical figures. They were people her mother had mentioned in bedtime stories. Shadows stirred at her feet as she opened another leather-bound volume of town records. The morning had slipped into afternoon, sunlight shifting across the library's wooden floors. Eleanor barely noticed, absorbed in her research. Then she found it, a property deed from 1943. The house at 217 Oak Street had belonged to the Martin family. Her family. Eleanor sat back in her chair, mind spinning. The connection was there, but she couldn't quite grasp it yet. With slightly shaking hands, she reached for the last letter in the tin. Unlike the others, this one was still sealed, the envelope slightly thicker. As she turned it over, her breath caught in her throat. There, in that same careful German handwriting, was a name she knew all too well, Margaret Martin. "Mom?" Eleanor whispered, staring at her mother's name. Shadow raised his head, sensing her distress. The letter trembled in her hands as realization crashed over her. These weren't just random historical documents. They were personal family history. The German soldier, Lucas, had written directly to her mother. The library seemed suddenly too quiet, too still. Eleanor's mind raced with questions. Why had her mother never mentioned this? What had happened between her and this young German soldier? The letters spoke of love, of hope, of plans for the future, yet Eleanor had never heard a whisper of this story. She looked down at the unopened letter addressed to her mother, feeling the weight of untold history in her hands. Shadow pressed closer to her legs, offering silent comfort as he had since the moment she found him on the pier. "Why would Mom hide this?" Eleanor whispered, her words barely audible in the hushed library. Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor, but he offered no answers to the mysteries that seemed to multiply with each revelation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the library windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. Eleanor sat motionless, surrounded by the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed until now. Her mother's name on that envelope seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken stories, waiting to be discovered. Shadow remained a steady presence at her feet, his watchful gaze never wavering. Together, they sat in the quiet library, surrounded by the echoes of a love story that had somehow found its way through time to land in Eleanor's hands. The evening air carried the tang of salt and seaweed as Eleanor walked Shadow along the weathered boards of the pier. She held the tarnished metal in her coat pocket, running her thumb over its ridges and curves as she walked. The setting sun painted the waves in shades of gold and pink, while seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing across the water. Ahead of them, a solitary figure stood at the pier's edge, fishing rod propped against the railing. As they drew closer, Eleanor recognized Tom Bennett, a fixture at the pier most evenings. His weather-beaten canvas jacket and faded baseball cap marked him as one of the regulars who found peace in the rhythm of casting and reeling. "Evening, Miss Eleanor," Tom called out, his voice gentle despite its gruff edge. "I see you've got yourself a companion these days." He nodded toward Shadow, who sat now, calmly at Eleanor's side. "Good evening, Tom," Yes, this is Shadow. He sort of found me, actually. Eleanor smiled, then found herself pulling the medal from her pocket, turning it over in her hands. Tom's keen eyes caught the glint of metal. That's an interesting piece you've got there, he said, setting his fishing rod aside. Mind if I take a look? Eleanor handed him the medal, watching as his weathered hands cradled it carefully. His expression shifted from curiosity to recognition. This is a German soldier's commendation, he said softly. From World War II, I've seen a few of these during my service years. He traced the eagle emblem with one finger. Where did you come across this? The story spilled out of Eleanor then, finding Shadow, the hidden box, the letters, and finally, the shocking discovery of her mother's name. Tom listened intently, nodding occasionally, his eyes never leaving the medal. You know, he said when she finished, I've heard stories like this before. During the war, quite a few young German soldiers tried to defect. Some couldn't stomach what was happening, others fell in love with local girls. It wasn't as uncommon as people might think. Eleanor's eyes widened. Really? I had no idea. Tom nodded, handing the medal back. The coast around here was watched pretty carefully during the war. But there were still ways for determined souls to slip through. Some locals even helped hide them. Do you think? Eleanor paused, gathering her thoughts. Do you think you could help me look into this? I feel like I'm fumbling in the dark here. Of course, Tom said without hesitation. The town archives might have something, newspapers, police reports, that sort of thing. And there are still some old-timers around who remember those days. My Aunt Martha, for one. She worked at the post office during the war. They began making plans, Tom suggesting names of people to talk to and places to check. Shadow sat quietly between them, his ears perking up occasionally at the sound of waves slapping against the pier posts. We could start tomorrow if you'd like, Tom offered. I know Martha would love to chat about the old days. She's always telling me I should visit more often anyway. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. That would be wonderful, Eleanor said, feeling a surge of hope. I can't thank you enough, Tom. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor noticed Shadow had grown restless. He stood at the pier's edge, staring intently at the darkening water below. His posture was rigid, almost protective, as if he were standing guard over something only he could see. Come on, boy, Eleanor called softly. Shadow turned reluctantly away from the water, but kept glancing back as they walked toward shore. There was something about his behavior that made Eleanor shiver despite the mild evening air. Tom noticed too. That's one special dog you've got there, he said quietly. Seems like he knows more than he's letting on. Eleanor nodded, watching his Shadow cast one final look at the waves before following them up the beach. The dog's unease was palpable, as if he were protecting a secret hidden beneath the pier's dark waters. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Seavale Harbor's town records office as Eleanor and Tom made their way inside. The building smelled of old paper and wood polish, with rows of filing cabinets stretching toward the back wall. Shadow waited patiently in Eleanor's car, having been denied entry to the municipal building. Where should we start? Eleanor asked, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of records surrounding them. Tom moved with purpose toward a section marked 1940 to 1949. The harbor master kept detailed logs of all dock workers during the war, he explained, pulling out a heavy leather-bound book. Security was tight back then. Everyone had to be registered. They settled at a wooden table, carefully turning brittle pages. Eleanor's heart jumped when Tom suddenly placed his finger on an entry. Look here, he said. October 1944. Lucas Weber, dock worker, assigned to loading crew B. The spelling's different, but it could be him. Eleanor leaned closer, studying the neat handwriting. There's more, she noted, scanning down the page. He worked there for almost 6 months. As they dug deeper, more pieces fell into place. They found work permits, timesheets, and even a handful of black and white photographs documenting the dock workers. In one particularly clear image, a young man stood among a group of laborers, his face serious but handsome, with dark hair and clear eyes that seemed to stare directly into the camera. That has to be him, Eleanor whispered, touching the photograph gently. He looks just like the description in the letters. Tom nodded thoughtfully. These records show he worked mainly night shifts, probably trying to keep a low profile. They spent the next hour copying relevant documents and photographs. As they were preparing to leave, Tom mentioned another potential source of information. "There's someone else we should talk to," he said. "Mrs. Callahan. She's lived here her whole life and has an amazing memory for town history. She'd be in her late 80s now, but her mind is sharp as ever." They found Mrs. Callahan tending to her front garden, despite the autumn chill. She was a small woman with silver hair and bright, intelligent eyes that lit up at the sight of visitors. "Tom Bennett," she exclaimed, straightening up from her flower bed. "And who's this you've brought to see me?" "This is Eleanor Martin, Margaret Martin's daughter," Tom explained. "We're hoping you might remember something about a young man who worked at the docks during the war." Mrs. Callahan's expression changed instantly, a mix of recognition and old sadness crossing her face. "Oh my," she said softly, "you're asking about the handsome foreign boy, aren't you? The one your mother used to meet by the lighthouse?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "You knew about them?" "Come inside, dears," Mrs. Callahan said, pulling off her gardening gloves. "This is a story that needs telling over tea." Inside her cozy living room, surrounded by photographs spanning decades of Seavale Harbor history, Mrs. Callahan poured tea into delicate cups while sharing her memories. "I was just a young woman then, but I remember him clear as day," she said, settling into her armchair. "Tall, dark-haired, with the most gentle manners you'd ever see. He spoke English well, but you could hear the German accent. Your mother would meet him in the evenings, usually by the old lighthouse where the lover's path starts." Eleanor leaned forward, hanging on every word. "Did people know about the relationship?" Mrs. Callahan stirred her teeth thoughtfully. "Some suspected. It was wartime. People were suspicious of anything different. But your mother, she had such a light about her when she was with him. You could see it was real love, not just some wartime romance." Her voice grew softer, sadder. "Then came that awful night. There were whispers about tragedy by the water. The next day, he was gone, and your mother, well, she was never quite the same after that." "What happened?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one knew for certain," Mrs. Callahan replied. "Some said he tried to swim out to a fishing boat, hoping to escape. Others thought he might have been discovered and arrested, but nothing was ever proven. The war ended soon after, and people tried to forget the uncomfortable things." They talked for another hour, Mrs. Callahan sharing small details that painted a vivid picture of life in wartime Seavale Harbor. When they finally said their goodbyes, the elderly woman pressed a small envelope into Eleanor's hands. "I kept this," she said quietly. "Found it in an old album years ago. Thought someone might want it someday." Back home, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, Shadow lying faithfully at her feet. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope Mrs. Callahan had given her. Inside was a photograph, worn at the edges but still clear. It showed her mother as a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, standing by the lighthouse. She was smiling, radiant with happiness, and beside her stood a tall young man. Eleanor now recognized, from the dock worker's photograph, Lucas. They looked so young, so full of hope and life. Eleanor traced her finger over her mother's smiling face, seeing in it a joy she'd never witnessed during her own childhood. The man beside her, Lucas, gazed at Margaret with undisguised adoration, his arm placed protectively around her shoulders. Shadow whined softly, pressing his head against Eleanor's leg as if sensing her emotional turmoil. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, still staring at the photograph that had captured a moment of perfect happiness before tragedy struck. "Oh, Mom," she whispered, "what really happened to him?" Eleanor sat in the familiar waiting room of Dr. Peterson's veterinary clinic, her fingers absently stroking Shadow's thick fur. The German Shepherd lay quietly at her feet, his eyes following every movement of the staff behind the counter. "I've been thinking about that tattoo you mentioned," Eleanor said when Dr. Peterson entered the room, the one in Shadow's ear. "Could we take another look at it?" Dr. Peterson nodded, kneeling beside Shadow. "Of course. Here, let me get my light. She pulled out a small pen light and gently lifted Shadow's ear. The dog remained perfectly still, as if he knew this was important. Yes, it's still visible, though quite faded. These kinds of tattoos were commonly used for military and service dogs. Eleanor leaned in closer. Can you tell where it's from? I have a contact in military animal services, Dr. Peterson said, straightening up. Would you like me to send them the framed information? They might be able to trace it. Yes, please, Eleanor replied eagerly. I'd really appreciate that. Dr. Peterson took several photos of the tattoo from different angles, making sure to capture every detail. I'll send these right away. It might take a few days to hear back though. Military records can be complicated. Eleanor nodded, watching as Shadow pressed his head against her leg. She couldn't shake the feeling that this mysterious dog had chosen her for a reason. 3 days later, Eleanor's phone rang while she was organizing books at the library. It was Dr. Peterson. Eleanor? I've got some interesting news about Shadow's tattoo, the vet said. Excitement clear in her voice. My contact came through with more information than I expected. Eleanor quickly found a quiet corner. What did they find? Shadow was registered with the United States Army in Germany, Dr. Peterson explained. He was a military working dog stationed at a base near Frankfurt about 8 years ago. Eleanor's heart raced. Germany? That's quite a coincidence. She thought of Lucas's letters, written so long ago in that same country. There's more, Dr. Peterson continued. After his service, he was adopted by a military family. The records show he was passed down through a couple of veterans' families over the years. The last registered owner was in Massachusetts, but the trail goes cold about 2 years ago. Eleanor sank into a nearby chair, her mind whirling. So he's been through several homes? Yes, all connected to military service in some way. It's actually quite common for retired military dogs to be passed along through veteran networks. They often understand each other better, if you know what I mean. Eleanor thought about Shadow's disciplined behavior, his quiet alertness, the way he seemed to be always watching, always aware. It made sense now. The interesting thing, Dr. Peterson added, is that these dogs usually stay in one place once they're retired. It's unusual for Shadow to have moved around so much, and even more unusual for him to have ended up here, apparently, on his own. Eleanor remembered finding Shadow on the pier, staring out at the water with such intensity. Do you think he could have been looking for something? Or someone? Military dogs are incredibly intelligent and loyal. Dr. Peterson replied thoughtfully. They can form deep bonds and have amazing instincts. Sometimes it seems like they know things we don't. After hanging up, Eleanor sat with Shadow in the library's reading room, processing everything she'd learned. Here was this dog, trained in Germany, passed through the hands of American veterans, somehow finding his way to her small coastal town, to her, just as she discovered letters from a German soldier written decades ago. Shadow rested his head on her lap, his warm brown eyes meeting hers with that same knowing look she'd seen since the day they met. A shiver ran through Eleanor, not of fear but of wonder. It was as if Shadow was more than just a lost dog she'd found. He was a living bridge between past and present, connecting her to a story that had started long before either of them existed. She ran her hand along his strong back, feeling the subtle ridges of old scars beneath his fur. Like the letters in the rusty tin box, like her mother's hidden past, like the mysteries still waiting to be uncovered, Shadow carried his own history. But unlike those silent pieces of paper, he was here, alive, present, as if he'd walked out of the past to help her understand it all. The morning after the storm, dark clouds still lingered overhead. The wind whipped Eleanor's hair as she walked along the beach with Tom and Shadow. The German shepherd seemed unusually agitated, pulling hard against his leash and whining. Easy there, boy, Tom said, noticing Shadow's odd behavior. Something's got him worked up. Suddenly, Shadow jerked forward with surprising strength, nearly pulling the leash from Eleanor's grip. He darted toward a section of beach where the storm had carved away part of a dune, leaving a collapsed wall of sand. Shadow, wait! Eleanor called out, but the dog was already pawing frantically at the exposed sand, barking with an urgency she'd never heard before. Tom jogged to catch up. I've never seen him this excited. Maybe we should check it out. They approached the collapsed dune where Shadow was digging furiously, sending sand flying in all directions. Eleanor noticed something dark protruding from the eroded sand wall, what looked like weathered fabric. Tom, look. She pointed to the mysterious object. There's something there. Tom knelt beside Shadow, who briefly paused his digging to let the humans take over. Using their hands, they carefully began clearing away the loose sand. As they dug deeper, more of the fabric emerged, heavy canvas, military green despite years of decay. It's a duffel bag, Tom said, his voice tight with recognition. Military issue, World War II era. Eleanor's heart began to race as they worked to free the bag from its sandy tomb. The canvas was deteriorated, but still intact, preserved by the dry sand that had entombed it for decades. With trembling hands, she helped Tom pull it free. Shadow sat watching intently, his tail still, as they carefully opened the bag. Inside, they found a carefully folded uniform, German military issue, the fabric surprisingly well preserved despite its long burial. "Oh my God," Eleanor whispered, her fingers brushing across the wool fabric. "Could this be?" Tom nodded gravely. German army uniform, exactly the kind Lucas would have worn. As they examined the contents more carefully, Eleanor's fingers found something metal, identification tags on a chain, the German text still legible despite years of tarnish. "These are his," she said, her voice breaking. "Lucas Weber." But it was what they found next that made Eleanor's hands shake. Tucked inside an internal pocket was an envelope, the paper yellow with age but protected from the elements by the uniform's thick wool. The letter inside was written in careful English, dated just days before Lucas disappeared. Eleanor unfolded it gently, reading aloud, "My dearest Margaret. By the time you read this, I hope to be free. I can no longer serve a cause I do not believe in. My heart and future belong here, with you. I have made arrangements. A friend who will help me disappear, papers that will give me a new identity. I know it will not be easy, but nothing worth having ever is. I dream of the life we will build together, top a small house near the sea, children playing in the garden, peace in our hearts. You are my future, Margaret. All I ask is that you wait for me. 3 days from now, meet me at midnight by the old pier. We will leave this place together, and never look back. With all my love, Lucas." Eleanor's voice faltered as she reached the end. Tom was examining the duffel bag's position in the dune, his expression grim. "The storm that night," he said quietly. "The historical records mention it was one of the worst in decades. Looking at where we found this, how it was buried." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He must have been waiting here, hidden in the dunes with his belongings, ready to meet your mother. But if he got caught in that storm, with waves this high..." Eleanor stared out at the ocean, now deceptively calm. The reality of what they discovered hit her like a physical blow. Lucas had been so close to his dream, to freedom, to love, to a future with her mother. Instead, he'd likely been swept away by the very waters he'd hoped would lead him to a new life. She looked down at the letter again, seeing the hope and love in every carefully written word. Her mother had never known, had probably waited at that pier in the storm, never understanding why Lucas didn't appear. Had she searched for him? Had she somehow guessed his fate? The secrets she'd carried to her grave suddenly felt heavier than ever. Tears began streaming down Eleanor's cheeks as she clutched the letter to her chest. Shadow pressed against her leg, offering silent comfort as she grieved for the life that could have been, for her mother's lost love, for Lucas's tragic end, for all the years of silence and wondering. They were so close, she whispered through her tears. Mom could have had such a different life. They could have been so happy. Tom placed a gentle hand on her shoulder as she cried, while Shadow kept his faithful vigil beside them. The waves continued their eternal rhythm against the shore, keepers of a decades-old secret finally brought to light. The evening sun cast long shadows across Eleanor's kitchen table, where papers, photos, and documents lay spread out like pieces of a painful puzzle. Tom sat across from her, his weathered hands carefully arranging timeline notes they'd made. "So, we know Lucas was working at the docks," Eleanor said softly, touching a faded work permit. He must have made connections there, people who could help him disappear. Tom nodded, pointing to dates they'd written down. The last time anyone remembers seeing him was 3 days before that storm. Mrs. Callahan said he'd stopped coming to the docks, but no one reported him missing right away because of the chaos from the weather. Eleanor traced her finger over Lucas's handwriting in his final letter. He was hiding somewhere in town those last days, waiting for the right moment. Her voice caught. Planning his future with Mom. Shadow, who had been dozing by the fireplace, patted over and settled his large head on Eleanor's lap. She absently stroked his ears while studying the German soldiers' photos. The uniform we found, Tom continued, his voice gentle, it was carefully packed away. He'd changed into civilian clothes, probably planning to blend in once he and your mother left town. Everything points to him being ready, having it all arranged. Eleanor wiped away a tear. But that storm, it was so bad the pier itself needed repairs afterward. If he was waiting nearby, maybe in those dunes. She couldn't finish the thought. The tide tables from that week show the water was already high before the storm hit, Tom confirmed. Add in those waves. He shook his head sadly. A strong swimmer might have had trouble, and in the dark, Shadow whimpered softly, pressing closer to Eleanor. She buried her fingers in his thick fur, drawing comfort from his solid presence. You know what's strange? She said after a long moment. All these years, I thought Mom's old stories about a German soldier were just romantic tales she made up. Finding out the truth, that Lucas was real, that he loved her so much he was willing to risk everything. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. It breaks my heart, but it's beautiful too. Their love was real. Tom reached across the table and squeezed her hand. And now we can make sure he's remembered properly. Not as some nameless soldier who vanished, but as a brave young man who chose love over war. Shadow lifted his head from Eleanor's lap and gazed at her with his soulful eyes. Sometimes she could swear the old dog understood everything. He'd led them to every discovery, as if he'd been carrying this story inside him, waiting for the right moment to share it. It's like he knew, Eleanor whispered, scratching under Shadow's chin. Like he was meant to help us find the truth. The dog's tail thumped gently against the floor, and he settled his head back in her lap with a deep sigh that seemed to echo her own mix of sadness and acceptance. Eleanor stood and walked to her window, Shadow following close behind. The sun was setting over the ocean, painting the waves in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere beneath those beautiful but treacherous waters lay the answers to questions her mother had carried to her grave. I won't let you be forgotten, Lucas, she whispered to the sunset. Your story deserves to be told. Your love deserves to be remembered. Shadow pressed against her legs, a warm, solid presence as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant colors. In that moment, Eleanor felt a deep connection not just to her mother's past, but to all the untold stories of love and sacrifice that the years had hidden away. Lucas's story was one of them, tragic but beautiful. A testament to the power of love to bridge any distance, even if fate had other plans. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in soft purple light. Eleanor stayed at the window, one hand resting on Shadow's head, holding the memory of Lucas and Margaret's love close to her heart. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear as Eleanor stood before the town's war memorial, carefully arranging chairs in neat rows on the grass. Shadow lay nearby, watching her work with attentive eyes. The granite monument rose solemnly against the blue sky, its surface etched with the names of fallen soldiers from multiple conflicts. Tom Bennett arrived early, wearing his old service medals pinned to his jacket. He carried a wooden display case he'd crafted himself, lined with dark blue velvet to hold Lucas' letters and medal. Everything ready? He asked, setting the case down carefully on a small table draped with a white cloth. Almost, Eleanor replied, adjusting a bouquet of white roses. The archivist from the Historical Society should be here soon. She's bringing the official documentation folders. People began arriving in small groups, their quiet conversations carrying across the memorial grounds. Mrs. Callahan came supported by her granddaughter, her aged face bright with emotion. Other townsfolk Eleanor recognized from her research filtered in 9, children and grandchildren of those who had known Lucas during his brief time in their community. Eleanor's heart leaped when she spotted her children walking up the path. Anna, in her nurse's scrubs, must have come straight from her night shift. David had driven up from college, his usually casual appearance traded for a proper button-down shirt. The sight of them both here, supporting her, made her throat tight with emotion. "Mom," Anna called softly, hurrying forward to embrace her. "The place looks beautiful." David hugged her next, a bit awkward but sincere. "Yeah, you did good, Mom. This is really important." The town archivist arrived with a leather portfolio containing the official papers that would make Lucas's story part of their permanent historical record. Eleanor had spent hours working with her, documenting every detail they'd uncovered about the young German soldier who had chosen love over war. As the small crowd settled into their seats, Tom stepped forward to speak. His voice, usually gruff, carried clearly across the quiet gathering. "We're here today to remember a young man who showed us that love knows no boundaries, not of nations, not of war, not of time itself," he began. "Lucas Weber came to our shores as an enemy soldier, but in his heart, he found something stronger than the hatred and fear that divided our world. He found love." Eleanor watched faces in the crowd as Tom spoke about reconciliation, about how time could heal even the deepest wounds between peoples. She saw heads nodding, saw hands being squeezed, saw more than a few tears being wiped away. "This medal," Tom continued, lifting the tarnished award from its velvet bed, "was given to Lucas for serving his country. But his greatest service to humanity was choosing to follow his heart, to risk everything for love and peace." The archivist stepped forward then, opening the leather portfolio. One by one, Eleanor placed the precious items into acid-free protective sleeves, the letters, the work permit, the photographs, and finally, the medal itself. Each piece of Lucas's story would be preserved, protected, remembered. Mrs. Callahan raised her trembling hand. "I remember that boy," she said, her voice wavering but clear. "Such gentle eyes he had, always helping others at the dock despite being a stranger himself. He loved your mother, something fierce, Eleanor. We all saw it." Other townsfolk began sharing their own connections, stories passed down from parents and grandparents who had known Lucas, memories of whispered conversations about the mysterious young man who disappeared. Each recollection added another thread to the tapestry of his life. Shadow, who had been lying quietly throughout the ceremony, suddenly lifted his head and gave a soft whine. The sound drew everyone's attention to the old dog, and Eleanor felt a shiver run through her as a gentle breeze rustled the roses. "We make this promise today," Tom said, his hand resting on the display case. "Lucas Weber's story will not be forgotten. His sacrifice for love will be remembered in our town's history, a reminder that even in our darkest hours, the human heart can light the way to peace." The archivist officially sealed the portfolio, marking it with the date and time. "These records will be preserved in our town's historical archives," she announced, "available for future generations to learn from and be inspired by." As the small ceremony drew to a close, people came forward to look more closely at the documents and share their thoughts. Eleanor stood between her children, feeling Anna's arm around her waist and David's strong hand on her shoulder. "I get it now, Mom," David said softly. "Why this was so important to you. It's not just about some old letters or a lost soldier. It's about remembering that love can change everything." Anna wiped tears from her eyes. "And about family," she added. "The ones we lose, the ones we find, the ones we choose." Eleanor pulled them both closer, feeling their arms tighten around her. The morning sun warmed their faces as Shadow padded over to join their embrace, pressing against their legs. In that moment, Eleanor felt the broken pieces of her heart knitting back together, strengthened by the bonds of family, both past and present. The gentle breeze carried the scent of roses across the memorial grounds, where Lucas's story would now live forever, a testament to love's power to transcend time, war, and even death itself. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the small coffee shop as Eleanor wrapped her hands around her warm mug. Across the table, Tom stirred his black coffee thoughtfully, the spoon making gentle circles against the ceramic. The bustling breakfast crowd had thinned, leaving them in a peaceful quiet broken only by distant kitchen sounds and soft music playing overhead. You know, Eleanor said, breaking their comfortable silence, I never expected finding those letters would change so much. Not just about Mom and Lucas, but about me too. Tom nodded, his weathered face softening. Sometimes the past has a way of healing the present. Watching you piece together Lucas's story, it stirred up things I thought I'd buried pretty deep myself. Eleanor looked up, noting the distant look in his eyes. What kind of things? Tom set his spoon down, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. Back in '83, I lost my best friend in Beirut. Jimmy Martinez. We'd served together for 6 years. He paused, swallowing hard. The thing is, I never told anyone this, but the night before, we had a fight. Something stupid about baseball teams. I went to bed angry, thinking we'd sort it out in the morning. His voice grew quieter. There never was a morning for Jimmy. The bomb took out his entire barracks while I was on patrol. For 40 years, I've carried that, the weight of those last angry words. Eleanor reached across the table, gently touching his hand. Oh, Tom, I'm so sorry. That's why Lucas's story hit me so hard, he continued. All those unspoken words, those plans never fulfilled. But, watching you bring his memory back to life, give him the honor he deserved. It helped me realize something. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we carry it forward. The morning light caught the silver in Tom's hair as he spoke, highlighting the gentle strength in his face. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, not romance, but a deep understanding between two people who had known loss. When Jack left, Eleanor said softly, referring to her ex-husband, I thought that was it. Game over. Failed marriage equals failed life, right? She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. But this whole journey with Lucas's letters, it showed me there are so many kinds of love stories. Some end sadly, some surprisingly, but they're all part of who we become. Tom's eyes crinkled at the corners. You're not defined by what happened with Jack, Eleanor. Look at everything you've accomplished these past few weeks. You've solved a historical mystery, brought peace to your mother's memory, united the town in remembrance. That's not someone who's failed at life. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't sad tears. You know what's funny? For the first time since the divorce, I'm actually excited about what might come next. Not just existing, but really living again. That's what healing looks like, Tom said, his voice gentle. It sneaks up on you when you're busy doing other things. They sat together for a while longer, sharing comfortable silence and another cup of coffee. Through the window, Eleanor watched people passing by on the sidewalk, couples holding hands, children skipping, elderly folks taking their morning walk. Each one carrying their own story, their own grief and joy. When they finally stood to leave, Tom hesitated by the door. Thank you, he said simply, for letting me be part of this, for helping me face some ghosts of my own. Eleanor smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. Thank you for believing in Lucas's story, when everyone else thought I was chasing shadows. That evening, Eleanor sat on her back porch, a light blanket across her legs against the cooling air. In the yard, Anna and David were playing fetch with Shadow, their laughter carrying across the grass. Shadow, despite his age, bounded enthusiastically after the tennis ball, his tail wagging with pure joy. Come on, boy. David called, a grin spreading across his face as Shadow returned the ball. It was the most relaxed Eleanor had seen her son since before the divorce. Anna flopped down in the grass, and Shadow immediately came to lick her face, making her giggle like she had as a little girl. Mom, he's worse than that puppy we had when I was 10. Eleanor watched them, her heart so full it felt like it might overflow. The setting sun painted everything in soft gold, making the moment feel almost magical. Shadow's coat gleamed in the light as he moved between her children, accepting pets and giving kisses, completely at home. She thought about how much had changed since that stormy day when she'd first seen Shadow on the pier. Back then, she'd felt as lost and wounded as the old dog had looked. Now, watching her family play together, hearing their unrestrained laughter, she realized they were all healing, separately and together. The weight of her divorce, which had once seemed like a millstone around her neck, had transformed into something else. Not gone completely, but more like a stepping stone that had led her here, to this moment of pure joy. She could build something new, something different but equally meaningful. Shadow suddenly looked up at her, his intelligent eyes meeting hers across the yard. In the golden light, she could have sworn he winked at her before turning back to play with her children. Eleanor smiled, settling deeper into her chair as the evening wrapped around them like a warm embrace. The laughter of her children mixed with Shadow's happy barks, creating a symphony of joy that filled her yard and her heart. It was a new kind of music, different from what she'd imagined for her life, but beautiful in its own unexpected way. The morning arrived wrapped in silver mist, the kind that made the world feel fresh and new. Eleanor stepped out of her cottage, drawing her cardigan closer against the early morning chill. Shadow padded beside her, his paws making soft impressions in the dewy grass. The familiar path to the pier stretched before them, but today felt different. There was no urgency in Shadow's steps, no desperate pulling at the leash. Instead, he walked calmly at Eleanor's side, occasionally brushing against her leg as if to say, "I'm here." Seagulls wheeled overhead, their calls echoing across the peaceful harbor. The water lay like polished glass, reflecting the pearl-gray sky. Eleanor's footsteps on the wooden planks of the pier created a gentle rhythm, a morning song accompanied by the soft lapping of waves against the pilings below. She found herself walking to the exact spot where she'd first seen Shadow, that stormy day that felt like a lifetime ago. The old German Shepherd had been sitting right here, staring out at the waves with such intensity, such purpose. Now, as they reached the same spot, Shadow simply lay down beside her, his chin resting on his paws. Eleanor settled onto a weathered bench, her hand automatically finding its way to Shadow's soft fur. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she murmured. The dog's brown eyes met hers, wise and gentle. The restlessness that had driven Shadow for weeks, the pawing at the pier boards, the urgent trips to the beach, the desperate searching, had melted away like morning fog. In its place was a peaceful contentment that touched Eleanor's heart. She remembered how he'd appeared that first day, battered and determined, carrying the weight of an untold story. Now that story had been told. Lucas' letters were safe in the town archives, his medal preserved as a testament to love's courage. His final days were no longer a mystery lost to time, but a chapter in their town's history, honored and remembered. The sky began to lighten, painting the horizon in delicate shades of pink and gold. Eleanor watched as the colors spread across the water, creating paths of light that seemed to bridge past and present. She thought about all the dawns that had broken over this same pier, the morning Lucas had hidden his letters, the day he'd tried to swim to freedom, and now this moment of completion. Shadow shifted slightly, pressing closer to her leg. His fur had regained its shine since those first days, and the limp that had marked his arrival had mostly faded. Like Eleanor herself, he had been transformed by their shared journey. The sun began to peak above the horizon, a brilliant golden disk rising from the sea. Its light caught the spray of waves breaking against the pier, creating countless tiny rainbows. Eleanor felt tears well up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. "We found him," she whispered, her voice carrying on the morning breeze. Shadow sighed deeply, contentedly, as if in agreement. The sound made Eleanor smile through her tears, her heart full of gratitude for this mysterious companion who had led her through grief to healing. The morning light strengthened, warming their faces. Eleanor could feel the promise of a new day, a new chapter, spreading before her like the brightening sky. The weight of the past few weeks, the discoveries, the revelations, the emotional upheaval settled into something precious rather than painful. Shadow's tail thumped gently against the pier boards, and Eleanor realized she was ready. Ready to move forward, to write her own story, to embrace whatever adventures lay ahead. The old German Shepherd had done more than help her uncover a lost love story. He had shown her that endings could also be beginnings. Together, they sat watching the sunrise paint the world in new colors, two souls who had found each other when they needed it most. The gulls continued their morning songs overhead, and the sea breathed its ancient rhythm below, and Eleanor felt perfectly, completely at peace. If even one moment stayed with you, hit subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story written gently for the heart.